Everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name's Jason Healy. I'm with the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at CEPA here at Columbia, at the School of International and Public Affairs. I'm so glad you could join us today. This event is hosted by the Saltzman Institute as well as the Data Sciences Institute. And I think that's representative of what we're trying to get done here at Columbia, is working across all the different schools, across the different departments, so that we can get our arms around the new information age, get our arms around data, around its uses, around privacy and security, around cyber conflict and cyber warfare. And so really happy that you could all join with us today. I know we've got at least a few Air Force veterans in the room. Do we have Air Force veterans around? Okay, good. All right, we got two. Great, thank you. So General Bender has some short comments, and then we'll go right more into Q&A. The general's here as part of a long line of cyber leaders who have come to Columbia to share what's happening in this interesting field. We started off with Admiral Rogers, the director of NSA and the commander of U.S. Cyber Command, the then Deputy Secretary of Department of Homeland Security, DepSec Mayorkas. Last October, we hosted both the Chief of Staff of the Air Force and the Secretary of the Air Force. We're really on an Air Force run here to talk on cyber, where they held their National Security Scholars Conference, and they decided to do that here at Columbia, not least because the Secretary of the Air Force was a CEPA alum. So studying cyber conflict has been particularly tough, because you try and get some deep research done, and then week after week, there's some new outrage in the headlines, some new attack, some new leak, something that hackers have figured out. Something groundbreaking seems to happen every week. I always thought it could be a lot worse. My colleagues that study nuclear warfighting could be having a bad week, and so it makes me feel a little bit better in this. But it is a critically important topic. I got my start in the U.S. Air Force, starting to look at these issues in the 1990s. And I hope many of you here will continue to find the government, the military, and particularly the Air Force a useful way to start your career or to transform your career after you move on from Columbia. And if so, it'll be tough to find a better model to do that than Lieutenant General Bender. You'll already see his bio on the posters and on the website, so I won't go through it because, I'm sure you noticed, it was quite lengthy. But I did want to at least cover some of the high points. He got a start not far from here on Manhattan College, so got started in New York City in the Bronx, and was in the Air Force and quickly started to command. It's 2017 now. He got his first command, I think around 1997, you got your first command. So 20 years of running Air Force operations and commanding the men and women of the Air Force. In the Air Force, he was working on tanker and airlift operations. So tankers, the planes that refuel the other planes. And I know many of you might not know much about the Air Force, but those kinds of operations are all about complexity and integration. How can you make sure that you've got exactly the gas that you need, exactly the material that you need for when it's needed? And the Air Force has been at war for 25 years. The Air Force has been at war, and so General Bender has been one of those that's been making sure that all works smoothly, that the warfighters are getting what they need when they need it. And that's where I think it's so similar to modern cyber operations, modern IT. We so often we get so caught up in the pew 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 of cyber war. You're seeing the maps, they're seeing the bytes going back and forth, and that's not what it's really about. That's someone's sales product. What it is about delivering IT capability 24/7 to the people that need it, whether that's in a business, whether that's providing the students here the IT that you need so that you can be a successful student, that the campus IT does, or what the general is doing now in the Air Force for incredibly complex military operations. As an Air Force CIO and Chief of Information Dominance, this is now his mandate. So please join me in welcoming Lieutenant General Bender.
Thank you. Jason, thank you for the intro, and I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to spend a few minutes with all of you today, so thanks for the organizers and for having us come in and spend a little bit of time with you. And I think just by the diversity of the audience and the interest the last couple of days, we came in last night and spoke at an evening function sponsored by the Harvard Business School. Today we were at MIT. Here we're at Columbia. We're going to Carnegie Mellon later. I'm going to spend some time on ABC national news for an hour, sort of live at 5 and a number of affiliates. So clearly across, a broad spectrum, not unique to New York City, but clearly a tremendous amount of interest in this topic. And I wanted to maybe start with just a few minutes of what role do I play within the Air Force to set some context. And then I hope we'll just have an open dialogue, either inspired by our outstanding and very qualified moderator in this space, or just based on your questions and what's on your mind. I'm happy to address anything and the best that I can. And I always have the caveat that if I really don't have an answer because it's kind of I'm connected to it, but I don't own that part of the portfolio, then I would be very happy to get, some information from you. I have a couple people here who can help me with that. And then we'll get you connected with either the experts or, do a short, answer to your question to get you the specifics, especially if you're, using it for some of your research and work that you're doing. So the Chief Information Officer in the Air Force is really dual-hatted. I work for the Secretary of the Air Force in that capacity, focused on the business of the Air Force. That is, sort of mission-effective, cyber-secure, affordable IT, given that everything in the United States Air Force and, frankly, the entire Department of Defense, and I would press beyond that to everything we do in this nation, is highly dependent on effective information technologies, one way or the other. It's ubiquitous in everything we do. It's our way of life. And so in that capacity for the Secretary, what I find myself doing more than I would have maybe thought so when I came to the job 2.5 years ago was actually leading a transformation of sorts, really trying to transition the United States Air Force from being the strongest and best Air Force in the world, the industrial world, to a capable, credible, effective, and powerful Air Force in the information age. And that's a bridge that we have to cross, and the transformation is the way that we're going to get there. In many ways, we have to reimagine the future for what is a very capable force today, but one that is in some ways ill-fitted and ill-prepared for the world we're living in today, and certainly the world going forward. So the way I look at that and what we're really trying to do in pulling this trick of a transformation involves three significant efforts related to my role as CIO in the Air Force. One of them has to do with, at the end of the day, we need to pay close attention to our information technologies, in all its many variants. It's a monstrous portfolio in any way that you would measure it for a global organization that is legacy. As you know, we've been around since 1947 and much longer if you consider the other services. And oh, by the way, there's nothing unique about the United States Air Force. And in fact, in many ways, I could argue the case that we're better suited for this transformation than maybe some of the other services because we are culturally predisposed to a technology force. We're the guys who brought you GPS. We're the ones that have brought, stealth, and we're the ones who have brought unmanned, aerial vehicles at scale. We've brought you the capability as a nation to find, fix, and finish a target anywhere in the world, thousands of miles away. Really in a way that has brought this nation to the point that other militaries out there could only dream of. But unfortunately, it's in the industrial age. So it's a new world, and we have to reckon with that. But the Air Force is focused on, collapsing the infrastructure the best that we can, getting to a joint, so all the other services combined into a single security architecture and giving ourselves better, modern, capable, information infrastructure with which to operate our systems going forward. Secondarily, we have a new mission that has been around a lot longer than we've been paying attention to it, but now we're deeply involved in taking care of the cybersecurity concerns, not just in our networks, but also in our standalone systems, our weapons platforms, our ICS and our SCADA out to the perimeter of every installation. And what I mean by that is we have to consider that while our networks are well defended with automation and good tools and frankly a pretty good structure of defense in depth, that's about 20% of the problem, and the rest of it is the wild, wild west. So nobody is necessarily paying enough attention to the fact that the systems of systems interdependencies and the key cyber terrain that actually makes this big Air Force mission effective is held at risk because the enemy is on our networks and is in our platforms. Think in terms of the entire space enterprise, the nuclear enterprise. These are responsibilities of the United States Air Force that are not in benign environments today because of this growing cybersecurity concern. And the third area that I would say is really required in order to transform is to transform the workforce. And this is not unique to the Air Force. In fact, every company out there in whatever commercial sector and every walk of academia and really, the entire nation has to come to grips with a digital, sort of life that we haven't necessarily been well prepared for. Obviously, Columbia is doing their part, as are many other institutions, but we're a legacy force that has been around a long time, and we didn't acquire the people with the skills and the capabilities and the experiences to necessarily address the challenges of the world we're living in. So we're having to harvest some of those people, send them through training, and think new and creative, on-the-job types of abilities, partnering with others to actually train that workforce and develop them along the lines of the workforce that we need instead of the workforce that we have. So those three main efforts all kind of come one way or the other under my portfolio. Other areas that I've been pushing extensively by virtue of need have been in the areas of innovation, working very hard to develop innovative approaches, process changes where required to overcome a bureaucracy that really is challenged by the speed with which the environment changes. And I would say that's really in the areas of process change and cultural mindset shift. And I think that as a CIO, I have found myself more often than not being the chief education officer, the chief innovation officer, the chief risk officer, you name it, because it all kind of comes to roost in the IT portfolio. So there's a lot of excitement around it because it is both our greatest strategic advantage and our challenge at the same time. And so, we're doing an awful lot as an Air Force today to prepare for an uncertain future. But at the same time, I'm confident that, together with industry and with others, we'll find, the way to do that and to actually advance the cause in a significant way. So how about I hand off back to you for some questions? And I've asked Jason to be very provocative in his questions so that you'll feel comfortable asking some tough questions.
Well, I'll start with the softball on, because you're talking about workforce, we're at a university. I'm concerned that in my own classes that I'm going to get the students spun up to learn about cyber and then launch them out to the workforce. And do they have the right skills? Is the workforce going to be able to catch them? Is there going to be a federal hiring freeze? So as students are getting ready and they're thinking about if they're inclined in the future in the government, if they're inclined in the future in the military and the Air Force, what are the right paths? What advice do you have on what they can start doing now to be a good fit to that? Do they have to be technical, or are you looking for other skills as well?
Yeah, so there's a lot in that question. I think I'll answer it this way. I think that there are tremendous opportunities going forward. Now, this is as you sit where you are today, keep your mind open to the absolute requirement, not just a nice thing to do, but an absolute requirement. If you depend on the nation's defense and you care about national security, we are going to have to reimagine how we go about doing that, at least in this space. Today, almost all of the R&D, all of the innovation, all of the intellectual capacity in this space. So we're part of the data science school here. I think that I'd be hard-pressed to get 5 data scientists in the United States Air Force. And if they have those skills, they're very dated. And so the point is the heavy reliance that government and private industry are going to have going forward. I call it public-private partnership, and have been pushing that. In terms of the opportunities, because we've recognized the challenge in front of us, we've used every tool available to us. I think at last count it was about 17 different ways to assess, to better develop, and to retain our workforce. But that's a challenge. Anybody who knows when you're especially at the very high end and you're working for the United States Air Force, maybe in collaboration with the NSA, you can go and triple and quadruple your salary by simply walking across the street. So we're not going to motivate anybody by money, but what I do hear regularly is you have a really cool job and doing really important stuff. So that's kind of our trade stock, working together for the common good at a higher level that you can within the military. So we're doing things like permeability of the workforce, in and out of industry on a regular basis. We are using the Guard in the Reserve extensively in this space in my portfolio, and granting what's called constructive credit. So when you come in at a PhD level because you work at the Microsofts or Cisco or wherever else, and you have these skills, we're not pushing you through the entire 3-year training regimen to dumb you down to a 101 level so you can build you back up to a PhD level. So everything is in play in order to allow ourselves to expose ourselves to where the real talent is, and increasingly we're being really creative to try to assess and to work closely in that partnership. Does that get at it a little bit?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I've got a whole list of questions, but I'd like to go to the audience. So if folks are ready. So
one of the two, former Air Force.
Yeah.
General, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us. Eric Greenberg, I'm a PhD student in the political science department here, and also an Air Force Reserve Intel officer. So in your opening comments, you described kind of technology as this system of systems and interdependent systems. So what steps is the Air Force actually taking to prevent the risk of inadvertent escalation? And so what I mean by that is during the Cold War, there were lots of studies that said, well, if you've got an adversary that attacks some node that we think is totally not connected to a broader node, but that system ends up being interconnected, you have the risk that escalation will spiral out of control. So I was wondering how we actually do that in the cyber space.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's what we had a little bit prior to coming in here having a discussion, and I frankly said that we need more work done on escalation, de-escalation in this space, because it's an undeveloped at best, right? We understand that, sort of philosophically or notionally. The question is, what's the practical aspect of some of the actions we would take? I would say that we've spent way too much time, to use Jason's term, in the foxhole, and really looking at this at a tactical level. And where more time needs to be spent is actually developing out operational plans related to how do we actually do this, and in particular, in the policy space, what actions and reactions are likely, and what is the grand strategy associated with cyber operations, operationalizing this domain, and the steps that we might take to hold would-be adversary at risk, determination of counter-value targets as they relate specifically to this domain, things that will keep them from escalating or take purported steps to de-escalate as appropriate. And so, I don't have a good answer other than to acknowledge that that is an area for great research. I hope your PhD is going to answer the question for us. Yeah, hopefully is right.
So that made me think of a question. A lot of commercial CIOs and chief information security officers are starting to do more on threat intelligence and saying, I was talking to one of my colleagues at one of the banks that said, if we're doing a new deal, say with one of our clients wants to bid for an offshore Brazilian oil deposit exploration rights, we'll go through the intelligence that we buy from companies and figure out which Russian or Chinese groups might be interested in that and figuring out how they operate. And then we'll be looking for those indicators in that business unit that's doing that deal. I mean, they're really tying in threat intel. Does it work the same in the military, or does that, within your CIO hat, are you worrying about that? Or is that kind of on the operational and intel folks that are diving in on that level?
Today, I would say that the preponderance of the work being done there to do data analytics, to mine social media and things of that nature is, first of all, at a very nascent stage, and it's being done almost exclusively within the IC, a part of which is the United States Air Force intelligence, intelligence community. What I'm attempting to do in terms of your question is the CIO involved there. I would, let me just sort of paint a picture of what I think all of us have to contend with, not unique to the military, but a good, maybe in your mind's eye, a perspective that defines where you will find yourself out there and the complexity associated with this, what I'll call a digital platform, a piece of which is threat analytics. But for the Air Force, and again, not unique to the Air Force, I have this legacy force that I have to contend with, and it would be so nice to just wipe it off the table and start new. That's why the Silicon Valley companies and the upstarts are so agile, because they don't have to worry about all of the baggage. But for me, this is a big Air Force and an extensive capital invested and an unaffordable solution to just wipe it away and start over. So I have to contend with that. At the same time, we're in the same world you're in, an Internet of Things, and the IP defined every device out there, and the sensors gone wild in terms of effectively my F-35 is a sensor. We call it a 5th gen, and we like to drop bombs out of it, but the reality is there's nothing 5th gen unless we optimize the sensors and the connectedness and put it into a campaign that basically leverages that capability. That's what the 5th gen piece of it is. So you got the IoT, then you've got software-defined everything, right, which really creates a new environment for you and changes the game on how you can think about solving problems. And the biggest problem for me is having to deal with this legacy acquisition system. I can't get anywhere fast because I have to go through a very defined process that for things that should take weeks and months take years. And of course, by the time I deliver on whatever that is, the environment has changed 3 or 4 times over, and it's no longer developed for the threat for which it was conceived. And so that's a challenge. So you've got software-defined everything. And then the threat analytics, which is, at the end of the day, the CIO's role becomes, when you take advantage of commercial industry, the fungibility of hardware, where really the only thing we care about is scalability and cost, we're in a position where we can really focus on securing data as an asset and securing the applications we use put against an open architecture. And the last piece of that, so I've named 4 so far, and the last is an ecosystem. It's all of us who are involved, all the stakeholders in the same kind of business, which I would submit to you very often in this space is everybody. Academia is doing their part, the policymakers are doing their part, government is heavily involved, industry, every commercial sector, we're all working on the same thing. So it's really, where are your partners? Where are your strategic partners that are willing to work with you going forward? And so it's all of those together, dealing with the legacy, dealing with this proliferation of sensors and IoT, dealing with software-defined data lake of that's your key asset, and the ecosystem. If you think of that in total, it's a digital platform, and it's really the environment that you're going to live in going forward, and you can't discount any one of them. You got to consider all of them, and that's what adds to the complexity.
Yeah, it's incredibly complex. If you have a question, catch my, oh, yes, sir. Okay, yeah, and Cam is coming across with a microphone. Thanks, Ingrid. Thanks, Cam.
Fair enough. Hi, I'm Al. I'm a worrywart. I need a favor. The whole Internet of Things, the security model is like 8 bytes. I can figure that out by hand, by myself, and that's going to be something maybe you can help by putting pressure on vendors. Your refrigerators you buy in the future, it's going to be so porous, and maybe since you have that budget and the cloud, maybe you can do something for us, and maybe you could also speak about it.
You're talking about securing all of the...
The toasters have 8-byte security. The refrigerators have 8-byte security. It's connected and way into the house.
Yeah. So this was the discussion I think we had earlier where it begs for, and I know everybody doesn't like this, but at some point, rules and regulations and compliance standards are going to be required, and I don't know why we haven't brought ourselves to that level of discussion at this point. We want to regulate our light bulbs and how much energy they can put out, but we don't want to regulate our refrigerators and the fact that they can spy on us.
Yeah, well, I really like this question because it touches on a couple of different points, and I don't know that struck with me is one of my colleagues at the Atlantic Council, I'm a senior fellow, the Air Force fellow there, Ian Fairchild, he was thinking about doing a strategy for DoD on the Internet of Things. And just, I think, today I saw a study that came out and said, that somewhere in the Air Force was looking for IoT-enabled weapon systems, where IoT is connecting in. You've got people on base that might have IoT systems in their homes. You've got petroleum and oil lubricants that probably have some IoT and some industrial control systems that are connected. I imagine a modern base and modern operations can't work without at least some amount of Internet of Things. So one is, I'm curious in your CIO role, how do you, everyone's having to deal with IoT in the environment and how you do that securely. And so I'd like to focus in and touch on that. And then also there's another piece in there in the, well, how can, does government procurement, does government contracting, and I know you're not the acquisition side, but does that have a role in this, or is the government such a small player in purchasing Internet of Things devices that we might not have as much pull as some might think?
No, I think, in a way, going back to how I answered your question in terms of the CIO's role here, ought to be, the imperative is for good, solid, thoughtful, centralized governance from which policy flows. And policy can only be effective if you actually hold yourself accountable to that policy, which again speaks to good, solid, centralized enterprise view for what you're trying to do. You have to know where you're going, right? So the IoT problem that is no doubt going to proliferate beyond our ability today would be managed by a cabal of 12 core function leads and 10 major commands buying and doing as they see fit because that centralized voice isn't as well established. I've spent 2 years trying to get to the point where I'm going to hopefully get the leadership to say, listen to the CIO, and we'll see if we can get there or not. to the earlier point in terms of what's our strategy with IoT, I sat with Ian Fairchild yesterday in my office.
I saw the giggles in the front. I wasn't sure if that was good or
Yeah,
bad.
so I mean, we're trying to use that and any other means that we can in terms of study and publishing in this to actually rein it in and keep some modicum of thoughtfulness associated with it. So I sit on the AT&T Executive Advisory Council for for big customers of AT&T, and I went down to their IoT lab, and for 2 days we marveled at all of what the gadgets are doing for you, right? I mean, just an amazing thing, and not a thought towards security.
You're kidding.
At least it didn't come up in the conversation, and that was, I was like at the end of the thing, I'm like, is anybody worried about securing this stuff?
Right.
Right. So, marvelous that Google Maps feeds your garage the note that it's time to open because you're coming around the corner. Does it open and somebody walks in and takes what they want before you come around the corner? That's a physical security issue, but we really need to think through the ramifications. Sir? Oh, I'm sorry.
Actually, the example of Google Maps and garage door openers is better. Stealing the car basically gives you a token to walk into the front door.
Yeah.
The problem is not, I submit the problem is worse than somebody snatching your lawnmower. The problem is a huge percentage of garage doors are insufficiently separated from the interior of the house. So the fact of stealing the car not only becomes the GPS to take you back to your driveway, which is security violation 1, but since the door automatically opens, you've now just basically said, steal my car and my GPS box, and by the way, take my jewelry and camera while you're at it.
Yeah. And I think that's getting to
And the obvious problem then becomes the Internet of eavesdropping things like the Samsung TVs.
And I think, this gets some what you're talking about.
We're getting to the WikiLeaks discussion here.
And you said it. But we haven't said Snowden yet either.
Yeah.
Is the complexity in here and the amount of vulnerabilities that we're adding to the attack surface. And one of the things that you said really kind of caught my ear in the first time is the CIO in trying to come out to all of these different commands and all of these different bits and saying, who's got the stick here, who's kind of in control and who's going to say. And then I think is one of the things that surprised me going from military to the private sector is that in many cases, these smaller companies that aren't as big as enterprise having sometimes more command and control around who can do what and can connect to the network than you do. I mean, if you've got the iron kernel that says, of course, it's my base, I'm going to connect this to the internet. I mean, it seems like they've got more, I'm fighting a war here. Than many of the companies. It really surprised me.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's more of a comment. And here, and you can say who you are when the mic comes next.
Noah Shackman with the Daily Beast. So, when you've got a 21-year-old airman, right? He's an airman, but he's also like a typical 21-year-old, and so that means he's got multiple personal devices too. So, I guess I've got a two-part question. Is number one, how do you take into account the security, features in a personal device, or how do you try to, use these unsecured how do you try to map these unsecured devices? And then number two is, we just got done with the biggest, most successful disinformation campaign of all time, and how, if at all, are you trying to account or trying to counter in your service online disinformation?
Great, thanks, Noah.
Yeah, so two really good questions. Let's talk about the airmen first, okay, because it really touches on a number of real challenges for us. We have a 21st century airman, highly connected, multiple devices, really, a digital native. And then we bring them into a legacy force and we tell them to leave all that stuff at the door. Sometimes for security reasons, and rightfully so, but many times just by convention, right? We'll hand you, something that was developed because you're scaling it across, 750,000 users, it's not of the quality. So, working to figure out how can we take advantage of commercial off-the-shelf and as-a-service offerings that perhaps require a little customization in the process that we use and the way we go about doing it, as long as we can satisfy ourselves with the security is there.
And I think the knee boards are a good example on that.
Yeah, the in-flight, you're talking about the...
Yeah. I mean, it used to be, instead of carrying all the charts, you've now got on the tablet, I think.
Right,
You've got,
yeah, electronic flight records and things of that nature, where you're now flying with an iPad and, putting a sticky up on the windscreen of an aircraft and, getting a satellite feed and basically wherever you are in the world having access to your home documents and things of that nature. So, we're doing it where it makes sense, but the bigger challenge is a dissatisfied workforce that is really concerned with stepping backward in time in order to, to when they come to the workplace. So, numerous efforts underway to try to address that. I think that security ends up being always, a question, but we want to fail safe to, the most secure device that you can do is the one that you unplug and just don't use it. And sometimes I wonder if that's the approach that we're trying to take. So, we have to address that. The second question that you had, I'm sorry?
It was on the disinformation campaign.
Yeah, so the disinformation. What I would say about that, it doesn't really enter into the U.S. military because of our, authorities and what our responsibilities are, other than to say there's a tremendous amount taking place effectively once we put our minds to it with the counterterrorism efforts, so against ISIL and stuff like that. We have been extremely successful as a larger team with the IC and others in identifying high-value targets and removing them from the battlefield, in some cases virtually, right? Or being able to pinpoint them based on their, their digital signature. And we've been very effective in going after them, and in fact, can make a case that we've almost become exquisite at that ability. And we're running a very aggressive information campaign against known bad guys in the ISIL area, and extremely effectively.
Sir, I think I was unclear on my question. So can I be more?
Yeah, please.
Which is, you just had a major Russian, not ISIL, disinformation campaign
Right.
that was incredibly effective, right? And that's, how do you keep your own airmen from being swayed by the same disinformation that is affecting the general populace? What do you do to counter? What do you do to counter that message, or how do you go after that?
One airman at a time, I think, honestly. Your question was very clear. I understand it. And so I think that the challenge is there that we have to have reputable everything, right? You have to have leaders willing to step into the breach and have a discussion about what's really taking place here and why it matters to you, and encouraging responsible decision-making, being thoughtful, right? So I talk all the time to and it's, my sphere of influence in this regard are the people that I work with, but trying to encourage them that you actually have to have a thought, you have to do some research, you have to find reputable sources of information with which you decide and make some decisions. And, how this happened to a nation like ours, I have no earthly idea that we could allow that to take place, but we did. So now we're trying to dig back out of it.
But it does strike me, that when I was in this field, we were talking about information. We were thinking about, in the Air Force, we were thinking about offensive counterinformation and defensive counterinformation, and we included counter propaganda, and we even brought in the weather people as part of the overall information operations, because we were thinking about what's the velocity of information, how can we counter messages, how can we get our own messages out to some success in allied force. And it strikes me that around 2003 we stopped doing information, and we got all cyber. And it ended up that the cyber was now the sexy bit, and we took the information operations folks and we stuffed them down into NDU, and then we forgot about NDU.
Right.
And so I think we would have been better equipped to deal with this in the 90s when that was a stronger part of the doctrine than cyber.
I absolutely agree with you, and now we're trying to resurrect much of those capabilities of the past to actually address that. So we are in. Really, when I said we're in an information war, that's what I'm talking about, is exerting influence over an adversary through information as opposed with kinetics, right? And if we don't see that and learn to react to it, and in fact exert our own influence through the information space, I can't imagine that we're going to have some success in tamping it down. It's left the barn at this point, and it's prolific, and we're going to have to address it.
Great. Justin, and then Jenny.
General, thanks for coming. I'm Justin Canfield. I'm a PhD student here at Columbia. Two-part question, if I may. I'll be brief. So, first is you mentioned the workforce, the Air Force workforce, and you mentioned training individuals who you already have versus bringing them in. I'm wondering which approach do you think is more successful? Where's the Air Force going with that? And is it different than the approaches used by the other branches? And then the second part of my question is a little unrelated, and it's maybe slightly outside of your purview, but I'm hoping you can shed some light on it anyway. You mentioned flexibility and agility being really important. So how involved are the JAGs in the operational aspects? And do you think that legal analysis slows down or puts you at a disadvantage somehow?
What was the very last piece? How involved are the JAGs, but what was the second piece?
And do you think that, if the JAGs are really involved, does legal analysis put you at a disadvantage in some way?
Guess what someone's dissertation is going to be about?
Yeah. So I think the workforce is, sort of a combination of all. Where, when you find yourself at a great disadvantage, you start to think creatively about how we can do that. So we are maxing out we first of all kind of swung towards, a cyber curriculum out of what had been, a more traditional COM information support, so system support. How do you put components in? How do you lay cable? How do you, so this is the workforce that we're dealing with, and they're ill-suited to the cyber, but that's where we started. The mission came to this, recognizing that there was a way to live within our means. Commoditize IT and repurpose the workforce towards doing it. So we're trying to train everybody we can, and aggressively going after that, increasing the seats, leveraging industry and others to partner with them. So with academic institutions, helping them understand what our requirements are, contracting with them to actually provide some of the training in a blended learning environment. And so everything that we can do to produce the workforce. The challenge is you almost can't keep up with it because you don't retain them long enough, and you're in this constant churn of trying to produce more. And we haven't even begun to define the organic requirement, meaning today, I'm on the hook to produce 1,735 airmen to be part of the cyber mission force nationally, working for Admiral Rogers as part of the cyber command, right? So we've been going at that hard for 3 years, and we'll finish it fourth quarter of 18 and get to the point where steady state, I have 1,735. And the other services are in exactly the same place. So we're all doing the exact same thing. But we haven't really defined the organic requirement beyond, so like I said, that cyber command mission is very well defined for Homeland Defense, national critical infrastructure, for helping the geographic commanders prepare to meet their offensive plans. And the third piece is cyber protection teams. Think of them as, sort of Johnny on the spot. You find a problem, you go fix it, and then you move on. So that group of 6,000 people, 1,735 from the Air Force, we're building as feverishly as we can to meet that requirement, but we haven't paid attention to, cyber people to protect our weapon systems, our standalone networks, our SCADA and ICS, and on and on and on. So there's an organic requirement over and above that. The challenge I see it is really one of capacity. We have very capable people. We're using all of the tricks in the books to retain them, and we don't necessarily have a retention problem per se. People like doing what they're doing, and it depends on where you sit. When I go out to Silicon Valley, they envy the fact that I have an airman for 6 years, 3 to train them and 3 to use them. They rotate every month, it seems, right? So good quality people moving on. The JAGs and the legal discussion, if I can, break back to that. We had a comment earlier that I think that there is a tremendous requirement to get around cyber law in general, and really understanding, sort of the norms associated with this, and working through the long process it would mean to actually establish new laws in our country related to this, and international norms related to this, because currently we can't point to anything that is a foul. We just know that it's a foul, but we can't necessarily, in a legal sense, hold it up against the standard. So the JAGs are involved, but typically after the fact. They need to be involved up front in sort of creating a new space for us and really thinking it through.
On the defensive side.
Yeah, on the defensive side,
yeah.
Sure.
Jenny was next.
Hi, my name is Jenny John. I'm a PhD student at Columbia University as well. My question is sort of tied with Jay's comment earlier, and I wanted to ask you, given that in the 21st century we have adversaries with relatively sophisticated information warfare doctrines, and under it lies electronic attacks, psychological operations, and we basically have to assume that from day one, these adversaries are going to actively undermine, our networks and the information resident in it. So given that the Air Force might be forced to operate in a constrained environment, which I was wondering how the Air Force systematically thinks about which aspects of the information it would choose to prioritize in that situation, and what are the necessary sort of functions of the systems and networks that are needed to support that prioritization.
Yeah.
So for example, if data is perishable after minutes, maybe you want to prioritize speed over its security, and you want to configure that.
And can I add to that, in the operating constrained environment, she was talking about information prioritization, like how do you do your defensive priorities, and I would also talk about exercise. We used to exercise flying when you're being jammed. How is the Air Force doing in exercising in the space in a constrained environment?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And so in terms of levels of security, it's actually fairly well defined, right? So something that is externally exposed over the internet is, data level 1 or 2. When you start to get into privacy information, data level 4, and, trade secrets 5 and above, this type of thing. And so well understood in terms of its level of security and the, rule sets associated with securing and protecting that is actually also fairly well understood. The challenge has been, in some cases, the unwillingness to, at the lower level, take advantage of others that can do the securing probably better than we can. So we're throwing everything at all the data and not necessarily really focused on the critical data that we care most about. And so that's a discussion ongoing and trying to figure exactly out how to do that. Then the second aspect of that is generally, if it's at the lower tier, there's policy that I've put in place and that we're following to, with meeting certain requirements, accept the fact that the commercial cloud is available to us and that there are some efficiencies there. Very little data really needs to remain, sort of sovereign to our, to a given installation. But there is an allowance for some data is so critical, and especially when you get into the special access and, really dark programs that we all, sort of would think in terms of the most critical trade secrets, then it's, it's pretty much a fortress mentality. And so there is a pretty good discernment at this point of the different levels of security, and then we're architecting solutions based on, how much we hold them dear. I think the last thing I would say there is leveraging technologies that are available to us that change the game in terms of not, today we go up and we collect who knows how many hours of imagery, and 99% of it sits on the production floor because we can't get to it. And so really taking advantage of modern, sort of machine learning and artificial intelligence to discern, imagery, look for anomalies, and really only focus on the data that we care about. The rest of it, we exhaust. So a lot of that effort. And your point was on...
like exercise. I mean, cyber and other things being involved in red flag and the other big exercises.
Yeah, so there's a number of flag exercises that go on today where we've put cyber on par with the other domains. And it's been, very helpful in thinking through problems. The challenges I was mentioning earlier, when you go with, kind of shut out the lights and now let's go exercise, everybody just stalls. And similarly, a day without space and everybody comes to a dead stop, and you end up white carding or, kind of granting yourself ability to go on with the rest of the exercise instead of, no kidding, stopping and thinking our way through these tough problems. So increasingly, we're not giving ourselves that pass, and I think all the services are very serious about cyber exercises in all of its manifestations.
Great. And last question, then we get to finish. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Jerry Seidman with a company called Orostore. You talk a lot about policy, and that's really the basis of the issue, whether it's regulatory policy or mission policy. And you've been circling on this issue, but you achieve policy by process. And the problem that maybe you're talking about, maybe you're trying is the process is complex because it's cobbling together different systems, it's cobbling together different needs, and most organizations will then solve the process with cobbling together systems, and every time you cobble together systems, you're introducing risk.
Right.
And so is the goal to remove that complexity? So, for example, to have any ways to express the policy. For example, this data may not be accessed outside the US, or these systems should only be accessed within these networks, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Is the goal to simplify that so that then you can operate on the policy rather than operate on the systems?
Yeah, and I think that what you're getting at, if I understand the gist of it, is this, what I talked about in terms of the role of the CIO in this case, right? So we have to have policy that drives an enterprise view. There will be winners and losers in that discussion, but you can't just operate freely in the environment we're in. Driving behavior and process change through policy is really, critically important to us. And
if I may, when I mean policy, I mean we'll set up data silos, not people process, but we'll silo data, we'll separate data, we'll replicate it here and there.
Yeah.
Those kinds of policies.
Yeah, and yeah.
Processes to achieve policy.
Correct, and I'm actually, that's what I'm saying, is at a CIO level, and this is managing enterprise IT, so data center consolidation, lowering the footprint, driving better decisions as it relates to that data center infrastructure as an example, or how are we going to handle data? So standing up a data capability for the Air Force through policy in terms of this is in and this is out, right? So driving fixes through enterprise level. Enterprise view is the critical aspect here because it all has to come together. So the answer to the question is yes. The question is how to do that, and it's somewhat easy to say and hard to do. And in particular in the Air Force, we don't have the best muscle memory in this area. So that's how we got in the mess we're in, and now we're trying to change it.
Great. Okay. Well, I'm sorry. I know there were more questions. I was seeing some more hands there. I got to one of my questions. I had another 15. So we'll have to invite you back, and hopefully we'll see you again. I know for me it's weird being in one of these high tops and not having a cocktail. So next time if we do it this way, we're going to do
that, Jay.
We'll do it right. Please, thanks. Give me a hand.